Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. When a man inherits his late uncle's peaceful farm, he expects quiet days and hard work, not a ruthless war with a powerful HOA hell-bent on stealing his land. What starts as petty fines turns into a high-stakes battle of fraud, corruption, and one hell of a reckoning. I had not set foot on my uncle's farm in over a decade, yet the moment I turned off the county road and the gravel crackled under the tires of my truck, something in my chest clicked into place. The place looked almost exactly as I remembered, the long split-rail fence running along the southern edge, the weathered but sturdy farmhouse sitting on the gentle rise, and the old red barn that my uncle used to paint himself every few years, insisting it had to be barn red, not that store-bought red. 86 acres of rolling pasture and timberland spread out around me, a patchwork of wilderness and history that still smelled like cedar, diesel fuel, and the stubbornness of the man who had lived here until the day he died. The estate attorney had handed me the keys only 2 weeks earlier. My uncle had left everything to me: house, land, tools, equipment, debts paid in full, and not a single mortgage hanging over the place. For a man who never married and never had kids, he ran the farm with a kind of quiet pride. I walked through the farmhouse the morning after I arrived and found it exactly as he left it. Boots by the door, coffee can full of loose bolts, a handwritten note about a leaky pipe under the sink as if he planned to fix it later. I spent a few days putting things back in order, airing out the rooms, getting the electricity checked, and reacquainting myself with the kind of honest work that makes your muscles ache in a way that feels earned. It was peaceful, almost idyllic, until the second Thursday of my return. I was repairing the latch on the barn door, humming a tune badly out of habit, when I heard the crunch of tires that were definitely not mine. I figured it might be the delivery truck bringing the new feed barrels, but the vehicle that appeared at the top of the drive was a compact white SUV with the unmistakable emblem of Pine Ridge Trails HOA on the door. 3 people stepped out like a committee sent from the heavens, except they radiated the opposite of benevolence. Leading them was a woman in a crisp beige suit and sunglasses big enough to qualify as protective equipment. She walked like the gravel owed her rent. I knew her type before she introduced herself. "Good morning," she called out, voice sharp like an email with too many exclamation marks. "You must be Mr. Hayward. I'm Karen Bellamy, president of the Pine Ridge Trails Homeowners Association." I leaned on the barn door, wiped my hands on my jeans, and gave her a nod. "This property isn't part of Pine Ridge Trails." She smiled the way a dentist smiles before telling you that you need several root canals. "We'll get to that. I have some documents for you first." She handed me a thick envelope, the kind that usually contains either a subpoena or a very bad offer. Inside was a neatly typed letter full of legal jargon, a long list of alleged violations, and at the bottom a total of $37,200 in supposed fines. Every violation was more absurd than the last. A tractor awning from 2005, manure odors from 2007, as if livestock ever smelled like roses, a chicken coop built too close to the boundary fence, weeds overgrown more than a decade ago, a mismatched section of fencing, and 35 more items that ranged from the laughable to the downright insane. I looked from the papers to her, wondering if she expected me to have a stroke right there in the yard. "These are from before my uncle passed," I said. "And even if they weren't, this land is outside your jurisdiction. Always has been." Karen clasped her hands behind her back like a tour guide showing me the ruins of my own patience. "The HOA has standing agreements with all surrounding properties. We maintain community standards. You'll need to settle the outstanding balance before we can proceed with integrating your property into the guidelines." "I'm not part of your community," I said plainly. My uncle wasn't either. This farm sits on its own parcel. Always has. Her smile thinned. "We have records indicating otherwise." "I'm sure you do," I muttered, flipping through the papers again. Some of the dates did not even line up with reality. The manure complaint listed a time when my uncle had not owned livestock at all because he'd been recovering from a broken leg. Not that any of that mattered. Their authority ended at the property line. Behind her, one of the enforcement officers, a man in his 30s with a neatly pressed uniform and an expression trying very hard to stay neutral, watched me with an odd flicker of something like sympathy. He introduced himself as Mark Draper. The other man, whose chest puffed out with the self-importance of someone whose entire personality revolved around carrying a clipboard, did not bother to give his name. Karen continued her speech, something about integration, compliance, and shared community values. The more she spoke, the more it sounded like a cult recruitment pitch with extra paperwork. I let her finish out of politeness, or maybe morbid curiosity, but when she wrapped up by saying, "The HOA has been here long before you," I laughed. My family owned this land before Pine Ridge Trails was even a suggestion in a real estate brochure. Her face tightened. She clearly did not enjoy being contradicted on territory she thought she ruled. "Regardless, we expect cooperation, Mr. Hayward. You're not getting it. Not now, not later." She exhaled slowly, then leaned in just enough for her words to feel like a threat. "People around here prefer order. If you don't comply voluntarily, we have protocols." "Good luck with that," I said. "Leave my property." Mark shot me a brief look, something between warning and apology, before following her back to the SUV. Karen paused at the door, took off her sunglasses, and said, "You don't understand how things work here yet, but you will." They drove off, leaving behind the dust of their arrogance and a stack of papers that I tossed on the porch like trash. I had expected a quiet first month on this land. I had expected to honor my uncle's memory, fix up what needed fixing, breathe a little. What I had not expected was a war with a neighborhood association that believed it ruled over land it did not own. The woman acted like this farm was an eyesore spoiling her kingdom. The problem for her was simple: I was not going anywhere, and this land sure as hell did not belong to them. The morning after Karen's little parade rolled off my property, I sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee and the stack of HOA papers spread out in front of me like roadkill I was obligated to inspect. I read every line, not because I believed a word of it, but because people who write nonsense with this much confidence occasionally hide dangerous things between the bullets and footnotes. The violations were ridiculous, the logic non-existent, and the arrogance practically dripping off the page. Still, I wanted to know exactly what kind of nonsense they thought they could pull. By mid-morning, I had written a formal notice declining any and all claims made by Pine Ridge Trails HOA. I printed it, signed it, and drove to the post office to send it with tracking and a signature requirement, purely so Karen would have to personally acknowledge receiving my refusal. I imagined her expression when she opened the envelope. It helped me enjoy the rest of my day. I came back to the farm and got to work repairing a section of the barn roof. I was halfway through replacing a warped plank when another car appeared at the top of the drive. This one was shiny dark blue and looked like it had never once in its life encountered mud, gravel, or any terrain not designed by suburban planners. A tall man in a charcoal suit stepped out. His tie alone probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. He introduced himself as legal counsel for Pine Ridge Trails, though he didn't give me a name. That was fine. I hadn't asked for one. He held out a folder thick enough to be a prequel trilogy. "We're here to resolve a misunderstanding," he said. "Consider this our good faith attempt to avoid escalation." I opened the folder. Inside was a crisp letter stating that my uncle had signed an agreement to join the HOA about 8 years earlier, complete with a dated signature and a line declaring that the farm was voluntarily entering the Pine Ridge Trails Covenant. The signature was supposed to be my uncle's. It looked wrong. Not obviously wrong, but subtly. Like someone had tried to copy his handwriting by memory rather than actually knowing it. My uncle's signature leaned slightly left, always. This one leaned right. It was also dated the same week he had been hospitalized after a stroke that left him unable to speak, much less sign legal documents. "Fake," I said. "Tell Karen to try again." This one wouldn't fool a drunk goat. The lawyer's expression stayed neutral, but his jaw tightened. "Mr. Hayward, refusing to cooperate will only make this more difficult." "I'm sure it will," I said. "For you." He left shortly after, offering one last monotone warning about escalation procedures. When his car disappeared down the drive, I stood there holding the folder, trying to decide if I should laugh or track down whoever forged my uncle's name and introduce their face to a fence post. I didn't have long to think, because Pine Ridge Trails wasted zero time moving from veiled threats to blatant harassment. The first fresh violation notice came the next morning, hand-delivered, taped to my gate like some deranged yard sale flyer. Apparently, I was now being cited for unpermitted construction noise from the barn repairs I had been doing. Never mind that this was a working farm and not a feng shui-compliant suburban garden patch. The second notice came 2 hours later. Unauthorized equipment placement. That equipment was my uncle's old tractor parked near the tree line. According to their letter, it was disturbingly close to a natural boundary. Whatever that was supposed to mean, it was stupid. The third notice arrived before sundown. Visual blight. The visual blight, according to Karen's very artistic use of bold type, was the sight of my clothes drying on a line behind the house. The line had been there since before I was born. I'd had enough. I installed 6 new no trespassing private property signs along the driveway and posted another by the barn stating in large letters that HOA personnel were not permitted on the premises. Then I set up a pair of inexpensive motion-triggered cameras loaned by my cousin. If Karen wanted to keep pushing her luck, she'd get herself on video doing it. The third day brought something I hadn't expected. Mark Dreiper, the HOA enforcement officer with the too neutral face. He drove up alone, parked at the edge of my property like he wasn't sure he was allowed to enter, and finally approached on foot. He kept his hands visible, palms open, an odd gesture unless you've had enough unwanted visitors to appreciate it. "Mr. Hayward," he said quietly, "I won't take much of your time. I just need to deliver this." He handed me another envelope. It was thinner than the others and bore Karen's unmistakably dramatic handwriting. I started to open it, but Mark raised his hand slightly. "I didn't read it," he said. "Not my place." I studied him for a moment. Something in his posture, the tension around his shoulders, the way he looked past me instead of at me, told me he wasn't thrilled about whatever he'd been ordered to deliver. "So what's the story?" I asked. "You just follow orders, or do you actually think I owe your boss 37 grand for manure that probably decomposed before half your neighborhood was built?" The corner of his mouth twitched. "I just work here, sir." He hesitated. "I'm not comfortable with how things are handled sometimes." That was interesting, useful even, but not something I could pursue now. "Well," I said, "you can tell your boss what I said last time, and what I'll keep saying. You all stay off my property, no exceptions." He nodded, almost relieved. "Understood." As he turned back toward his truck, he added quietly, "You might want to get a lawyer. They're not going to drop this." I watched him drive off, wondering if he'd just given me a warning or a kindness he wasn't supposed to offer. By afternoon, the county clerk emailed me back, confirming what I already suspected. My property was not, had never been, and could not legally be part of Pine Ridge Trails. No annexation, no covenant, nothing. So I drafted a formal harassment complaint against the HOA and submitted it to the county's Property Rights Division. Then I forwarded copies to a lawyer recommended by the clerk, someone who specialized in situations just like this. Before the sun set, I received yet another violation notice from the HOA. This one cited obstructing community compliance officers and displaying aggressive signage. I laughed when I read that last part. My signs were polite. If I'd been aggressive, they'd know it. But Karen was escalating, and from the frequency of these notices, she wasn't just invested, she was frantic. I didn't know why yet, but I had a feeling I'd find out soon enough. It took only 1 week for things to go from ridiculous to criminal. I just finished replacing the east fence line that had sagged after last month's storms. I was muddy, sweaty, and halfway through a sandwich when I noticed something off near the barn. At first, I thought it was the wind playing tricks on my eyes, but as I got closer, the reality sunk in. The padlock on the equipment shed had been busted clean off. Not picked, not rusted through, snapped. Inside, 2 battery units for my quad were missing, not just tossed around, gone. I didn't even bother with 911. I filed a police report through the county sheriff's department online, knowing full well that unless I caught someone red-handed, they'd put it down to trespass and petty theft. Maybe it was just opportunistic thieves. Maybe not. But then I saw the sign, nailed right into my boundary post in fresh white plastic. Pine Ridge Trails property. Access restricted. Violators will be prosecuted. I stood there blinking, trying to process the sheer insanity. That sign wasn't on their land. It was a good 20 feet inside my side of the property line. It wasn't faded. It hadn't been blown in by wind. Someone had physically walked onto my land and planted it like they were Christopher goddamn Columbus. I tore the thing down and marched it back to the porch like a trophy from a failed invasion. I hung it on a nail by the kitchen door, right next to the busted padlock. 2 days later, a county inspector showed up unannounced. Said he was there in response to an anonymous complaint about unpermitted structures on the property, specifically the barn, the tool shed, and my house's back deck. The deck had been there since the mid-70s. The inspector wasn't a bad guy, just doing his job. He looked sheepish as he stepped around the property, taking photos and measurements, but he couldn't tell me who'd filed the complaint. "Just says community concern," he muttered. I asked him if it was from the HOA. He didn't say yes. He didn't say no, either. "You'll be fine," he added before he left. "None of this looks recent." I wanted to believe that, but I'd lived long enough to know these kinds of paper games build on each other. One lie begets another. One complaint becomes a file becomes a record becomes a problem. The last straw came on Sunday. I was up early, fixing a roof beam on the chicken coop with my cousin Luke. He's built like a bar bouncer and has the attention span of a squirrel on Red Bull, but he's good with wood and loyal like a hound dog. We were up on ladders hammering in new supports when we heard a car crunch up the drive. 2 sheriff's cruisers. Now, police out here don't just show up without reason. Either something burned, bled, or someone made a serious enough claim to warrant a visit. Sure enough, one of the deputies approached with his hand resting gently on the grip of his sidearm. "Sir," he called out, "we received a call from the Pine Ridge Trails HOA. Complaint says you've got unlicensed laborers working without permits, possibly undocumented." I damn near fell off the ladder. "You're telling me they called you because my cousin is helping me fix a damn roof?" The officer looked up at Luke, who waved from the ladder and shouted, "Hey, I've got a Costco card. Does that count?" The younger deputy cracked a grin. The older one just sighed. "Do you have ID for your workers?" "Hell yes, I do. One of them's my blood, the other's my neighbor. Neither one's illegal, and both are unpaid because I feed them better than any paycheck." I led the officers around back, showed them the coop, the tools, and the crew in question, which consisted of Luke and my retired neighbor Paul, who was mostly holding nails and drinking lemonade. They asked some questions, took a few notes, and within 10 minutes, it was clear they knew this was bullshit. Still, they logged it. "Just doing due diligence, sir. We don't control who makes the call, just how we respond." I nodded, understanding but pissed. After they left, I made some changes. First, I upgraded the motion-activated cameras to full perimeter coverage. I spent half a day sinking new poles into the property corners and setting up geo-referenced stakes. I even bought reflective boundary tape and ran it along the fence in key areas. If anyone crossed that line again, it would be on video, GPS, and in high resolution. Second, I called my attorney. We weren't playing defense anymore. I had him file a formal cease and desist letter to the HOA citing harassment, defamation, trespassing, and unlawful surveillance. He sent it by courier, and I made damn sure Karen had to sign for it. Third, I notified the sheriff's office directly, not just the dispatcher, the actual captain. I told him what had happened, laid out the pattern, and submitted copies of my surveillance footage along with a timeline of the complaints and intrusions. He told me, and I quote, "This is starting to smell like abuse of civic channels. We'll log it. If it escalates, call me directly." I liked that. But what I liked even more was the look on Karen's face when, the next day, she pulled up to my gate, spotted the new camera pointed directly at her license plate, and immediately turned around. The woman had balls, but apparently not enough to smile for the camera. Later that week, a notice appeared on the Pine Ridge Trails Community Board, one of their public pages, which I checked occasionally just to monitor the level of delusion. It read, "Residents are reminded that non-compliant adjacent properties present a serious concern for home values and community safety. Cooperation is essential. We encourage peaceful integration, but all tools are on the table." All tools, huh? That sounded like war. And I was more than ready to return fire. When you find someone's been screwing with your land, your tools, your name, you get mad. But when they forge your dead uncle's signature and try to rewrite the legal map of your property, that's not anger, that's war footing. I spent the better part of a Tuesday morning digging through the county's public land records. I started online, but half the documents from back before 2010 were still in paper form, or worse, on microfiche like it was 1976. So I drove down to the Douglas County Records Office, a squat government building that smelled like a mix of toner and ancient frustration. The clerk at the front desk, a wiry guy named Kenny with a buzz cut and a sense of humor made entirely out of sarcasm, didn't bat an eye when I told him what I was looking for. "You think somebody tried to ghost annex your property?" he asked, tapping away on his terminal. "I think someone tried to file a fake agreement with my uncle's name on it to force my farm under HOA control." "Well," Kenny said, spinning his chair toward the back, "welcome to land records hell. Keep your arms and legs inside the existential dread." An hour later, he handed me a manila folder and a box full of pulled records. There it was, filed in 2015, a document titled Annexation Consent Agreement with my uncle's full name, a signature, a witness line, and a seal that looked real enough to be state-issued. The signature. I'd stared at enough of my uncle's handwriting to know it wasn't his. Even more interesting, the witness signature was none other than Karen Bellamy. According to the timestamp, the document had been filed one day before my uncle was hospitalized for a stroke that left him speechless for the rest of his life. No way he signed anything voluntarily that week, especially not something turning his back on every angry rant I'd ever heard him give about those plastic HOA bastards. That night, I pulled out every scrap of paper I had that included my uncle's. Real signature, old receipts, birthday cards, even an invoice he once scrawled on a pizza box lid. I made copies and contacted a certified forensic document examiner. She met with me 2 days later at her office near Atlanta. A quiet woman in her 60s with half-moon glasses and a stare that could probably peel paint. She looked at the originals, compared the slants, the loops, the pressure points, then said calmly, "That signature on the annexation is a forgery, and a clumsy one, frankly. I got that in writing, notarized, sealed, and then sent it straight to my lawyer. We were done playing whack-a-mole with fake violations. It was time to pull the whole damn rug." Meanwhile, things started slipping on their end. Mark Draper, the enforcement officer with the calm voice and too neutral face, showed up again. This time, no SUV, no clipboard, just him in jeans and a flannel, knocking on my porch like a man who didn't want to be seen doing it. "I don't work for them anymore," he said. I raised an eyebrow. That a confession or a job application? He smiled weakly. "Let's call it a peace offering." He handed me a USB stick. "This is everything I copied off the HOA's internal server before I quit. Emails, meeting minutes, draft annexation maps. Some of it's boring, some of it, well, I figured you'd want to see." I thanked him and offered a beer. He declined, said he had to keep his head down for a while, and left without asking for anything in return. I plugged in the drive and found a trove of digital poison. First, emails between Karen and someone named Doug Lanton, executive director at Praxis Land Development, LLC, a real estate developer known for buying up rural land and turning it into eco-villages for people who think compost bins make them pioneers. The emails dated back nearly 5 years. They discussed long-term strategies for expansion, quiet integration of adjoining parcels, and one particularly bold line from Karen: "Hayward's land is underutilized, and his health is declining. We can secure the parcel with minor document work." She had written that while my uncle was in the hospital. Further down, I found a presentation labeled PRT Phase 4's Expansion. Slide 3 showed my land outlined in red, labeled Projected Redevelopment Area. It wasn't just some idea. They'd already drawn blueprints for townhomes, walking trails, and a boutique community orchard. They had literally planned to bulldoze my family's farm and put in an artisanal yogurt shop. Another set of files included HOA meeting notes where Karen openly discussed coercive compliance pressure, manufactured violations, and dealing with resistance using municipal leverage. I saved those in triplicate. One last email, dated 6 months ago, chilled me more than all the rest. It was from Karen to the Praxis Land team. "Hayward's nephew took ownership. Former federal contractor, unmarried, asset-rich, but likely isolated. Apply standard pressure. He'll fold or settle." They'd done a background check on me. They knew I'd worked as an environmental forensics consultant. They knew I lived alone. They thought that made me easy prey. They made the same mistake everyone makes when they stare at land and forget the person standing on it. I handed the files to my lawyer. He nearly dropped his coffee reading the emails. He scheduled an emergency hearing for the following week and requested a preliminary injunction against HOA contact until the matter could be reviewed. But it wasn't just about court anymore. This was bigger than fines or fences. This was attempted theft backed by forged documents, planned coercion, and corporate collusion, and my uncle, God rest him, was right to hate these people. The day the injunction hit Karen's mailbox, I imagined I could hear the screech of her SUV's tires from across the ridge. It was official. A temporary restraining order signed by a Superior Court judge barred her and anyone acting on behalf of Pine Ridge Trails HOA from entering or contacting me in any way, physically, electronically, through intermediaries, or via the absurd parade of compliance notices they'd weaponized. That included HOA mailers, violation letters, in-person visits, even so-called courtesy reminders. One more breach, and they'd be violating a court order. The legal counterstrike had begun. My lawyer and I had drafted the filing as a multi-pronged assault: forgery, attempted annexation, harassment, defamation, and trespassing. But the keystone, what really got the judge's attention, was that USB stick Mark Draper had given me. The documents showed not just bad behavior, but intent. This wasn't incompetence. This was an organized effort to annex my land for private development under the cloak of HOA authority. And now it was in the public record. 2 local journalists picked up the story within 48 hours. One of them, a guy named Vince from the Douglas County Ledger, called me directly. We met at a diner the next morning where I laid out a redacted version of the digital files. He nearly choked on his coffee when he saw the Praxis land blueprints showing townhomes stamped right over my pasture. "You know what this is?" he said, his voice going low. "This is a development fraud case waiting to blow up. This isn't just you. They're probably doing this all over the county." "Good," I said. "Let's make some noise." And noise we made. The Ledger ran a story titled "Developer HOA Collusion Accused of Targeting Private Farmland," with a photo of me standing in front of the barn, arms crossed, scowl locked in place. I hadn't meant to look like a protester at the Alamo, but that's the face you make when someone tries to steal your land with a forged pen. By the weekend, I'd gotten 6 emails and 3 handwritten letters from other property owners, people on the outskirts of Pine Ridge Trails or adjacent neighborhoods, with their own horror stories. They'd been threatened with fines over chickens, barn colors, hay bales visible from the road. One man told me his daughter couldn't park her used Toyota in the driveway without getting a violation notice for aesthetic nonconformity. Aesthetic nonconformity. Like we were living in a damn fashion magazine. A few of them came out to the farm. We sat on the porch drinking cheap beer and swapping stories. Some of them laughed when I told them about the visual blight accusation over my clothesline. One woman said they'd tried to fine her for planting non-native species, specifically daisies. It was like HOA bingo, except every square was petty tyranny. They weren't ready to file lawsuits, but they were ready to talk. And talk they did. A local news channel picked up the momentum. They aired a segment with footage of my property, the ridiculous signs HOA had planted, and a dramatic voiceover describing how a quiet farm became ground zero in a battle over property rights. Karen declined to be interviewed. I wasn't surprised, but she wasn't quiet either. Late Sunday night, I caught her in the headlights of my truck, standing on the edge of my southern boundary, talking to 2 men I didn't recognize. They had clipboards. One of them pointed toward my barn, the other toward the open field that rolled down toward the tree line. I flipped on my high beams and drove straight toward them. Karen turned deer in the headlight style, then bolted for her car. The other 2 hesitated a second too long enough for my new security floodlights to catch their faces on camera. Both were Praxis land contractors I found out later, named in internal memos Mark had given me. They were still surveying my land, even under court order. My attorney filed for a contempt motion the next morning. It was granted. Karen was now officially facing civil charges for violating a court injunction, trespassing, and attempted interference with a legal investigation. The contempt hearing was scheduled within the week. Praxis land, for their part, went radio silent. But the real turning point came when the district attorney's office got involved. They contacted me through my attorney and requested access to the full set of documents Mark had leaked, including metadata. They were opening an official investigation into HOA corruption and fraudulent land claims. And then they dropped the bomb. This may constitute criminal conspiracy under state development code violations. It was no longer just my story. It was a case. Mark Draper, still keeping his head down, agreed to a private deposition in exchange for prosecutorial immunity. His lawyer negotiated the terms. In that deposition, Mark laid out everything, From Karen's meetings with Praxis Land to the internal orders to falsify violation claims in a pressure campaign against non-integrated properties. The prosecutors called it a textbook abuse of HOA, authority with intent to defraud, and they were just getting started. By the end of the week, Karen's allies within the HOA began to splinter. The treasurer, a man named Lyle Jensen, abruptly resigned. Rumor was he had flipped to save himself from charges. HOA board meetings were postponed indefinitely. The neighborhood Facebook group, once a hive of smug passive aggression, went eerily quiet. One of the last things I did that week was install a large sign at the end of my driveway. Not just for Karen, for everyone watching. It read, "This land is not for sale, not for annexation, not for HOA fantasy." I figured they'd need a reminder, especially once indictments started flying. If you've never seen a woman who thought she ran the world get dragged into a courtroom to answer for the very empire she built, let me tell you, it's a damn sight worth waking up for. Karen Bellamy showed up to her contempt hearing in a navy blue blazer and a smile so fake it should have come with a warning label. Her attorney, some Metro Atlanta type with glossy shoes and a jawline sharp enough to cut glass, tried to downplay the incident on my property, claimed she hadn't trespassed. Claimed she was inspecting shared buffer zones for landscaping integrity. The judge, an older woman with no patience for buzzwords or bull, looked over her reading glasses and said flatly, "Miss Bellamy, you were photographed standing 21 feet into a parcel explicitly excluded from your jurisdiction 4 days after you were legally enjoined from doing so. The only thing in question here is whether you're bad at maps or bad at following court orders." That smile disappeared. The hearing didn't last long. The judge found her in contempt, hit her with a hefty fine, and scheduled a hearing on the forgery and fraud charges now pending against her. Karen's lawyer made a motion to suppress the USB files Mark had provided, arguing chain of custody concerns. It failed spectacularly. The court deemed them admissible, especially after Mark Draper's in-person testimony, under oath, confirmed their origin. He sat there in a gray suit, hands folded, voice steady. Said he hadn't wanted to be part of it anymore. Said he'd joined the HOA to keep things orderly, not to steal land. When asked why he finally came forward, he looked at me from across the courtroom and said, "Because I realized they were counting on everyone to stay quiet." And he didn't. My lawyer patted me on the shoulder. We weren't done yet. The fraud hearing was scheduled as a full civil proceeding, but the DA's office announced their own move that same week. They were filing criminal charges against Karen and 2 other HOA officers, Lyle Jensen, the treasurer who'd resigned, and a man named Scott Beller, HOA's contracted legal counsel. Charges ranged from forgery to filing fraudulent documents with the county to attempted unlawful annexation and conspiracy to defraud. It was surreal, watching the power dynamic flip like a flipped tractor, metal in the dirt and wheels spinning nowhere. Karen, who had once walked onto my property like a queen inspecting a new province, was now scrambling to avoid jail time. Praxis Land, the developer who had courted her, issued a limp press release claiming they were unaware of procedural misconduct, but leaked internal emails, courtesy of Mark, proved otherwise. There was one that made every reporter's jaw drop. Karen writing to Praxis Land's director stating, "Hayward doesn't know it yet, but he'll fold. Every man folds eventually when he's surrounded. Turns out I didn't fold. Turns out I built a legal bonfire and invited the whole county to roast marshmallows on it. More allies came forward. A local land use attorney offered pro bono consultation to others facing overreach from HOAs. A retired judge wrote an op-ed titled "The Case for HOA Reform in Georgia," citing my lawsuit as a turning point. The phrase Hayward Clause started floating around legal forums, an informal term for clauses in HOA bylaws that had quietly expanded jurisdiction through ambiguous wording and unenforced community cooperation agreements. Turns out my case wasn't just explosive. It was precedent-setting. And it wasn't just the lawyers and reporters paying attention. One evening, I got a visit from a state senator's aide. Young guy, dressed like he'd just walked off the set of a local campaign ad. Said the senator was working on drafting new legislation around HOA transparency, annexation limits, and the right of landowners to dispute jurisdiction without first being fined into bankruptcy. He asked if I'd be willing to testify at the committee hearing. I told him hell yes. But even as all that moved forward, I didn't forget why this started. I kept working the farm, same as ever. The chickens didn't give a damn about court proceedings. Neither did the fields. I fixed irrigation lines, repaired fencing, even got the old tractor running again with a new pair of batteries, since the original ones had mysteriously disappeared in the early days of this mess. And every time I saw one of those slick cars drive by, some HOA holdout trying to see if I'd caved, I made sure the sign at the end of my drive was clean, upright, and clear. This land is not for sale, not for annexation, not for HOA fantasy. Karen's house, I heard, went up for sale shortly after her indictment. Funny how fast people sell their castle when the walls fall down. If you'd told me 6 months ago that my return to this farm would kick off a chain of events leading to a statewide legal reform, televised hearings, and indictments that read like a Netflix script, I'd have assumed you were drunk, or maybe just too deep into HOA Facebook horror stories. But here I was, not only still standing, but watching Karen Bellamy's empire crumble like a sandcastle in a hurricane. The criminal proceedings moved fast, surprisingly so. I figured someone upstairs wanted to make a point before the next election cycle. Karen, Lyle Jensen, and Scott Beller were all formally indicted. The most damning charge, forgery of public documents, a felony in Georgia. Karen pled not guilty, but the evidence was stacked like a cord of firewood in December. Mark's testimony, the forensic handwriting analysis, the metadata from the HOA server, and the fact that my uncle had been in the hospital when the signature in question was allegedly made. I was subpoenaed to testify. I wore my best pair of jeans, a clean shirt, and my boots, because if I was going to speak for my uncle, I was going to do it dressed the way he'd want me to. The courtroom was full. Local press, state observers, and a handful of neighbors who'd clearly come for the spectacle. Karen sat at the defense table with a legal team that looked more like Wall Street fixers than suburban litigators. Her expression? Controlled panic. The kind you see on a pilot when 2 engines are out but they're still smiling for the passengers. When I took the stand, I didn't give a speech. I just told the truth. I told them about the farm, about my uncle, about how the land was never part of any HOA, how no agreement was ever signed, and how I discovered the forgery after being hit with a stack of violations that read like HOA fan fiction. I explained the theft, the trespass, the pressure. I explained what it's like to watch people circle your home like vultures, waiting for you to crack or sell. I could feel the room shifting. Even the jury looked pissed. But the moment that changed everything wasn't mine. It came from a surprise witness. Lyle Jensen, the former treasurer turned state's witness, testified under oath that Karen had personally ordered the backdating of documents. She'd instructed the HOA to manufacture compliance letters, claiming it was just administrative noise to bring the outsider into line. When asked why he was cooperating, Lyle's response was plain. I signed up to help mow grass and keep the playground safe, not to commit fraud for a real estate scam. He delivered that line like a man who knew he was trading reputation for redemption. And in that courtroom, it landed like a brick through a stained glass window. Karen's lawyer tried to pivot, blame miscommunication, misinterpretation, enthusiastic administration, but the jury didn't buy it. The verdict? Guilty on multiple counts. The sentence wasn't prison. Karen had deep pockets and expensive lawyers, but it was 6 months of house arrest, 2 years probation, a personal fine of $120,000, and, perhaps worse for someone like her, a lifetime ban from holding any HOA office or consulting role in the state of Georgia. Scott Beller and Praxis Land weren't so lucky. Praxis Land was hit with an injunction blocking any development plans on annexed land statewide until a full audit of their acquisitions could be completed. That little scheme of theirs, dead in the water. And the ripple effect didn't stop. The state legislature passed the Hayward Landowner Protection Act. Yeah, they actually used my name. It required all future HOA expansions to file public notices, offer opt-out clauses for adjacent properties, and prohibited any retroactive enforcement of covenants without a signed and notarized agreement. It also imposed strict penalties for HOAs caught misrepresenting their authority. Reporters swarmed for weeks. My farm became a symbol, a rallying point for every homeowner who'd ever been fined for painting their shutters the wrong shade of beige. I didn't ask for that, but I didn't fight it either. In the middle of all this, I got a letter. It was from the lawyer who'd represented my uncle during his final years. He'd found a sealed envelope in the safe deposit box, addressed to me. Inside was a handwritten note. Silas, if they ever come sniffing, don't let them bully you. This land's been ours for generations. If they want it, make 'em bleed for it. Love, Uncle Dean. I laughed when I read it. The old bastard knew exactly what was coming, even back then. I framed it and hung it in the hallway, right above the shotgun. By the time summer rolled around, the fields were green again. The air smelled like honeysuckle and diesel, and the last of the HOA's paperwork nightmares had stopped arriving in my mailbox. The farm, at last, was quiet. No more fake citations slipped under my gate. No more strange SUVs parked near the tree line with binoculars and clipboards. No more courtesy visits from people who talked like missionaries but acted like repo men. Karen Bellamy had vanished from public life. Her house sold in May. Cash deal, rumor said. New folks moved in, a retired couple from Tennessee who planted tomatoes and waved every time they passed. No suits, no clipboards, just folks. Pine Ridge Trails HOA went into a kind of cold stasis after the trial. Their board dissolved under court supervision. The county appointed a temporary overseer, a man from the planning commission with the charisma of a filing cabinet and the ethics of a bulldog. His job was to audit every dollar and every decision made under Karen's leadership. I heard he found duplicate invoices, phantom violation fees, and one absurd line item for community morale consulting. Whatever that means. They held a new election 3 months later. Smaller board, more transparency, and not a damn soul ran unopposed. Apparently, when a neighborhood watches their board president go down for felony forgery on the 6 o'clock news, they start paying attention to who's stuffing envelopes and writing bylaws. Me, I stayed out of it. I'd fought my war. I won. Didn't mean I forgot, didn't mean I forgave, but I had fences to mend. Real ones. Soil to test. A coop full of chickens who'd survived more legal drama than any poultry had a right to. The rhythm of the farm came back slowly. Honest work, sunrises, late dinners. It's amazing how much peace there is when no one's trying to put a dollar sign on your land. Still, the world didn't let me off the hook completely. One morning, I got a knock on the door. A woman from Atlanta, early 30s, clipboard tucked under her arm. My first instinct was to slam the door, but she wasn't HOA. She was from the state. Turned out the legislature had passed the Hayward Act with bipartisan support, and now they were establishing a state registry of exempt properties, places that had been targets of HOA overreach but legally proven independent. Mine was top of the list. She asked if I'd be willing to speak at the signing ceremony. I told her I didn't do speeches. She said I could just say a few words and glare meaningfully. That I could do. So, I stood next to the governor under a white tent with folding chairs and too many cameras. I shook hands with legislators who hadn't returned my emails 6 months ago. I gave my little glare, said my little piece. This land's been in my family for over 100 years. We didn't sign anything. We didn't agree to anything. We don't owe anyone anything. And if anyone tries this again, I'll fight twice as hard, because I won't be the last person they come for. But I damn sure was the first one to drag them into the light. Applause, flashbulbs, a long drive home. Later that week, I got a letter from one of the neighbors who'd visited me during the early days. The guy with the daughter who got fined for her car. He said he'd used my case to fight back, and he won. Said his HOA backed off completely after the law passed. He even included a photo of him standing next to his beat-up Toyota in the driveway, middle finger up, laughing his ass off. I stuck it on the fridge. That fall, I built a new gate at the front of the property. Reinforced steel posts, solar-powered lights, full motion sensors. Over the top. Maybe. But the gate wasn't just for keeping people out. It was a message. I hung a sign in bold block letters. Hayward Farm, private land. Since 1894, HOA trespassers will be fed to the chickens. Underneath, I added a smaller plaque. Protected under Georgia state law. Hayward Act. Annexation fraud prohibited. A few months later, a young couple from down the road asked me if I'd speak at a community workshop they were holding. New homeowners wanting to know their rights, avoid scams, fight back when necessary. I said sure, because if there's one thing I learned from all this, it's that the people who hide behind procedure and politeness are counting on your silence. But this land taught me something else. You don't stay quiet when someone's trying to erase you. You get louder, you plant your boots, you name the fraud, you show your teeth. And you fight like hell until they remember who actually owns the ground they're standing on.